Take a slow breath and feel the quiet settle. The gentle river of time. The night opens like a slow breath. The air is soft, almost shimmering with quiet. The light moves gently across the ceiling, the way moonlight drifts through thin curtains, weightless, unhurried. You can feel the world exhale. Everything loud folds away. The day releases its hold, and the body begins to loosen. Somewhere far away, waves break against the shore, slow and constant, like a memory that refuses to fade. The hum of the room, the rhythm of your breath, they become one. Tonight, we drift not into dreams but into time itself. Imagine a lantern flickering in a harbor long ago, its flames small against the dark. The sea sighs beyond the wooden docks, carrying the scent of salt and tar and the voices of sailors half asleep. It is the middle of the 17th century. A ship rocks gently on the tide, and among its passengers sits a young man from a small Dutch village called De Bilt. His name is Jan Erson. The wind touches his face, cold and new, carrying him away from everything familiar. Behind him lies a flat land of windmills and quiet canals. Ahead, only mist, only the open ocean, stretching into silence. He does not dream of glory. He dreams only of beginning again, of soil beneath his hands, of work, of small mornings that belong to no one but himself. The ship creaks softly, and time for a moment stands still. Each wave that lifts the hull feels like a slow heartbeat, steady, patient, endless. When the first shore appears, it is not the grand promise of paradise, but a thin line of grey and blue. Teen Amsterdam, the settlement that will one day become New York. There, Jan steps onto rough wooden planks, the salt still in his hair, the air heavy with rain. The town is small, its houses close, its streets still half mud. He finds work where work exists, scrubbing floors, carrying buckets, hauling wood. Each day folds quietly into the next, marked only by the sound of tools, the murmur of water, the soft crackle of a hearth. There is no wealth, no audience, no noise. Only motion, repetition, survival. And within that still rhythm, something begins to root. A name, a line, a life. When someone asks him where he is from, he answers in a whisper, from De Bilt. His accent carries the round vowels of his homeland, and the name lingers like a faint song. Over time, it becomes something new, softer, more certain. Vanderbilt. It is not the name of power yet, not of marble or mansions, only of a man who worked quietly beside the river. And in that stillness, beneath the low clouds and endless labor, the first thread of a dynasty is woven. The night around him deepens, the lamps burn low. Somewhere nearby, a bell tolls for evening, its echo rolling across the dark water. Jan rests his hands on the edge of a wooden table, scarred and worn. The grain of the wood feels alive, warm against his palms. He breathes slowly, listening to the hum of the wind through the narrow streets. The city is small, but the world feels large. Above him, stars drift through the fog, faint, trembling, but constant. In their light, a future waits, quiet and unknown. And so, from the hush of that moment, the story begins to move, not in leaps or triumphs, but in small ripples spreading outward through time. A ferry across a narrow bay. A child watching his father work. A name passed softly from one generation to another. The river of life flowing gently forward, patient and sure. Time continues like a slow current, smooth and steady. The world changes shape, but the motion remains the same. Seasons shift, houses rise, children grow, and with each generation, The name Vanderbilt drifts a little farther from its beginning. From the quiet labor of a single man comes the hum of ships, the rhythm of rails, and the gleam of distant lights on iron tracks. Yet beneath all of it, beneath the noise of engines and the breath of fortune, the same calm heartbeat remains. Tonight, we will follow that rhythm. We will move gently through centuries of work and wealth, through silence and splendor, through the long echo of one name carried on the slow tide of history. Not to chase the noise of greatness, but to listen to the stillness beneath it, the quiet persistence of human hands shaping the world, one breath, one motion, one dream at a time. Cornelius Vanderbilt, The Rising Water. The 19th century begins quietly along the edge of the sea. The air over Staten Island carries a clean, sharp salt, and the light moves slowly over the tide. Each morning, fog curls along the river like breath from the earth itself, and the ferry bells ring with the sound of distance. In a wooden house near the docks, a boy named Cornelius Vanderbilt wakes to the murmur of water against the shore. The walls are thin, and the sound of oars fills every corner, soft and rhythmic, like the pulse of a living thing. He is a child of motion. When the wind rises, he listens. When the tide turns, he knows. Books never hold him long, the river does. He leaves school early, not in rebellion, but in quiet understanding that his lessons will come from the water. It is the century of steam, though few yet understand its promise. The young Cornelius feels it before he can name it, a power both patient and unstoppable, like the tide that shaped his island home. Each morning, he helps his father ferry passengers across the harbor, his hands blistered, his eyes bright. The cold bites at his fingers, but the rhythm keeps him warm. The boat rocks, the oars rise and fall. Day after day, the same crossing, the same slow song of effort and return. The sun burns the fog away, the wind carries it back again. He begins to know every current, every shift of the tide. The water, once strange, becomes a language he can read with ease. Years drift by, marked not by calendars but by crossings. The boy becomes a man, his shoulders broad, his patience deep. He saves the coins he earns, counts them quietly in lamplight, and one spring morning he buys a small boat of his own. It is nothing grand, a single-mast ferry built from oak and iron nails, but to him it feels like the beginning of a horizon. He paints the hull by hand, smooths the edges, watches the wood glow in the low afternoon light. When he launches it, the sound is small, a gentle splash, yet it carries the weight of a lifetime. He ferries passengers through mist and sunlight, from one shore to another. The crossings lengthen, the profits grow. He learns that movement is more than travel, it is connection. To carry others across is to carry himself forward. In the quiet between destinations, he listens to the hum of the current beneath him, to the faint hiss of wind across the bow, to the way the world moves without hurry. He begins to understand endurance, not as struggle, but as flow. One season turns to another. The harbor grows busier, filled with sails and voices. He adds another boat, then another. The docks begin to echo with his name, soft at first, then certain. Cornelius, the ferryman. Cornelius, the one who never stops. His fleet expands with the patience of the tide. He studies the shape of trade routes, the whisper of new engines that run without oars. Steamships appear on the horizon like dark clouds, powerful, strange, alive. Many distrust them, fearing the hiss, the fire, the unknown. But Cornelius does not fear. He watches the smoke rise and sees the future in its shape. He builds his first steamboat with the same quiet focus he once gave to his oars. The metal gleams like water under sun. When it moves, it does not rely on muscle or wind, but on heat, on pressure, on the invisible strength of transformation. The river carries the sound of its engine, low, steady, endless. People gather along the shore to watch it glide, a small miracle sliding through the fog. Cornelius stands at the helm, hands resting on the rail, eyes calm. The world has changed, and he is changing with it. The years unfold like water over stone. His ferries become lines, his lines become routes, his routes stretch into states. From New York to Albany, from the Hudson to the Atlantic, his ships trace the borders of a growing nation. The docks hum with voices and machinery, with the scent of salt and iron. Money comes, and with it, a new kind of stillness. He builds not palaces but systems, bridges of movement, networks of rhythm. Each train track he later lays is an echo of those first river crossings, from shore to shore, from here to there, always forward. At night, in his home by the water, he still listens to the wind. He still feels the tides pull beneath the noise of progress. The rooms are larger now, the lamps brighter, but the quiet remains the same. His success does not roar, it hums. He sits by the window, watches fog drift over the bay, and thinks of the boy who once rowed until his hands bled. The world has grown vast, but the pattern has not changed. Motion, patience, return. He is no longer just Cornelius. The people call him Commodore now, a name both formal and affectionate, a title shaped by respect. It suits him not because it shouts of command, but because it carries the sound of water, the rise and fall of waves. He has become part of the rhythm he once served. His empire of steam stretches along the eastern coast. Ships depart at dawn, their whistles cutting through the fog like slow music. Trains move inland, carrying the heartbeat of industry through forests and fields. Commerce thrives, cities grow, but he remains a man of the harbor, drawn to the edge, to the line between solid ground and shifting tide. He walks the docks at sunset, his steps slow, his gaze steady on the water. The light glints off the rails like ripples, and he feels both near and far from everything he built. In the evenings, the workers gather near the shoreline, their lanterns forming constellations in the dusk. Steam drifts upward like breath, blending with the clouds. The world is louder now, engines, whistles, laughter. Yet within that noise there is peace. Cornelius sits near the pier, feeling the vibration of ships moving out to sea. He knows that every sound, every motion is part of something greater, the long conversation between human hands and the water that carries them. Time softens even power. As age comes, he moves slower, but his eyes remain bright. The river still speaks, though its voice has changed. He can hear it beneath the clang of iron, beneath the whistle of trains. It tells the same story it always has, and of return, of continuation, of endless flow. The name Vanderbilt begins to mean more than a man. It becomes a current moving through generations, gentle but unbroken. When he grows old, the people who once feared him for his sternness come to see him differently. They remember not the hardness of his bargains, but the constancy of his work. He never sought glory, only motion. He taught that progress, like a river, does not rush, it endures. He stands on his veranda, the sea wind folding his coat around him, and watches the horizon blur into light. His ships move like shadows over the water, steady, inevitable. On his final voyage down the Hudson, he sits quietly, wrapped in a thick wool coat. The world glides past, factories, towns, steeples and bridges, all born from the rhythm he began. The air smells of steam and coal, but beneath it he catches the familiar salt of the open sea. He closes his eyes, The motion of the boat lulls him, slow and constant. Somewhere within, he feels that first crossing again. The buoy, the oars, the fog, the sound of water folding beneath wood. Everything that was once beginning has returned to stillness. They will remember him as the richest man of his time, the builder of rails, the commander of engines, but in the quiet truth of things, he will remain the ferryman, the boy who rode through the dawn mist, the man who learned from water how to move without haste, how to rise and fall and rise again. The tide takes his name and carries it outward, over oceans, into history. Long after he is gone, his ships will keep gliding through the grey light of morning, their engines whispering through fog. The rails he built will hum beneath the weight of countless journeys. The docks he once walked will echo faintly under the steps of those who follow. And somewhere, at the edge of Staten Island, the water will still lap against the shore, as calm and patient as the beginning of time. The story of Cornelius Vanderbilt is not a tale of conquest, but of rhythm, the rhythm of breath, of motion, of return. It begins in labor and ends in quiet. The river that shaped him shaped the world too. And in that slow, eternal movement, he finds his rest. The quiet air. The morning after his father's passing was not loud. It began, as all great changes often do, in silence. The wind outside moved softly over the Hudson, and the curtains of the great house swayed in a rhythm that seemed to match his breathing. William Henry Vanderbilt sat at the edge of his desk, his fingers tracing the smooth grain of oak. On the surface of that wood lay papers, deeds, ledgers, bonds, thin sheets of wealth, carrying numbers that represented more power than one man could ever hold. $100 million, they said. A number that did not feel real, a number that, even in his hands, remained distant, like a reflection on still water. He did not feel triumph, only weight. In the quiet that followed his father's final days, William found that sound itself had changed. The house spoke differently now. Footsteps seemed to echo longer, the clocks ticked slower, and even the morning birds outside the window sang with restraint, as if aware that the master of the house had gone. He had inherited everything: the railroads, the steamships, the lines of iron that stretched across a nation still finding its rhythm. But more than that, he had inherited his father's shadow. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, a man who had wrestled power from tide and steam, who had built his fortune with calloused hands and unyielding will. William admired him deeply, yet feared the echo of that name. To inherit greatness was not the same as creating it. He opened a window, letting in the scent of coal and river. Somewhere far off, a train whistle called through the morning mist. Deep, low, certain. It was his father's sound. It carried through the wind like a memory of motion, the hum of empire reduced to a single note. William closed his eyes. He thought of Staten Island, of the boy his father once was, rowing across the grey harbour, his muscles straining against the tide, his eyes fixed on a future he could not yet see. That memory was not his own, but it lived in him as though it were. His inheritance was not just wealth, it was the rhythm of effort that had made it. When he first walked through the office that morning, clerks had paused to watch him, their faces respectful, their voices lowered. They saw the richest man in America. He saw only a caretaker, a man holding something vast and restless, something that could never truly be owned. The day passed in steady quiet. Papers were signed, schedules reviewed, letters sealed. The routine continued as it always had, but beneath it, William felt a subtle unease. Money moved like a current, powerful, invisible, unstoppable. It whispered through ledgers, through banks, through every hand it touched. And though he commanded it, he knew he was also bound by it. When evening came, he sat alone in the study. The lamps glowed amber, the air smelled faintly of smoke and polish. On the desk before him lay his father's old watch, still ticking, steady as breath. He lifted it, held it to his ear, and for a moment it felt as though time itself was speaking softly, not of gain or loss, but of endurance. He whispered to the empty room, "This is too much for one man to hold." And in that confession, the burden settled quietly, like dust in sunlight. The still house. Days became weeks and the mansion began to breathe again. Servants returned to their rhythm, the echo of footsteps softened, the air filled once more with the faint, invisible pulse of life. Yet William remained unchanged. He worked from dawn to dusk, moving through ledgers with precision, his handwriting small and neat, his speech quiet and measured. He had no taste for parties, no desire for grand halls or silk-draped celebrations. The city outside was awakening to excess. Mansions rising like marble mountains, carriages gilded with gold leaf, streets glittering under gaslight. But within his walls, time slowed. He lived surrounded by beauty, but it was not beauty that comforted him. What steadied him was order, the predictable rhythm of work, the knowledge that each figure, each decision held a kind of fragile harmony. Yet even as he balanced the ledgers, he could feel imbalance in himself. The wealth that others envied had begun to feel like a living thing, breathing, demanding, unrelenting. He remembered telling his son once, "It takes all of me to keep this alive." Every fortune, he knew, was like a garden. It grew wild if not tended. It demanded hands, attention, and patience. And the larger it grew, the more it consumed. There was no stillness in prosperity, only motion disguised as calm. In the afternoons, he would walk the long corridors of his home, listening to the distant hum of trains beyond the window. The sound rolled like thunder far away, low, endless, and strangely soothing. It reminded him of breath, of continuity, of the invisible force that moved through every life and every age. Sometimes he would pause by the window overlooking the Hudson. The river gleamed faintly beneath the pale sky. Barges drifted slowly, smoke rose in thin ribbons from chimneys. He thought of the men who worked there, the ones hauling coal, guiding ships, building rails. Their labor was the true pulse of his fortune. Without their hands, his wealth was only ink and paper. As dusk fell, he often sat in the parlor with no company but the ticking of clocks. The walls, lined with paintings, seemed to absorb the dim light, holding it gently like a memory. His children, already grown, filled their days with travel and art and society. He did not begrudge them. He wanted them to live freely, untouched by the gravity that pressed on him. One evening, his daughter asked, "Father, why do you never rest?" He smiled faintly. "Because the world never does." It was not pride, it was fact. The lines of rail his father had built stretched across a continent, carrying lives, goods, hopes, and time itself. To stop was to let the rhythm falter, and yet inside him he longed for quiet, for the kind of stillness his father had never known. When he did rest, it was near the window where the river caught the fading light. The room would fill with the scent of ink and wood and faint tobacco. He would lean back, close his eyes, and feel the murmur of his own heart in time with the distant train whistles. It was not joy nor sorrow, only awareness. The strange peace of understanding that nothing, not even wealth, could still the river of time. As years turned, his wealth grew beyond measure. $200 million, more than any man before him. The newspapers wrote of his fortune as if it were legend, as though he had built a second empire upon the first. Yet when asked about it, he would only sigh. "It is too much," he once said, "too much for peace." The house remained quiet. Servants moved like shadows through hallways of marble. The clocks continued their soft, persistent ticking. In the stillness of those rooms, William became both master and prisoner, surrounded by everything yet untouched by it. Sometimes he dreamed of his father, not as the great Commodore, but as a younger man on the water, rowing through fog. He would wake before dawn, heart slow, breath calm, and think perhaps that was the truest form of wealth, to move with purpose, with no need to count the distance. The city outside glittered brighter each year, but the house stayed dim, a world of velvet shadow and restrained grace. When guests visited, they spoke softly, as though entering a cathedral. They left saying they had never felt such calm. They did not know it was not peace they felt, but fatigue. The deep, eternal weariness of abundance. William carried it with grace, never complaining, never raising his voice. His fortune expanded, his heart contracted. Yet beneath that weight, there was also something beautiful, a quiet discipline, a devotion to balance, to the invisible art of keeping order in a world that wanted chaos. And though he sometimes felt like a man walking underwater, each motion slow and heavy, he never stopped. He had inherited a river, and he understood that to stop rowing was to sink. The river of legacy. When age came, it arrived like dusk, softly, without sound. The years folded around him, layer by layer, until even the noise of the city felt distant. He no longer traveled often. He preferred the still corridors of his home, the muted gold of afternoon light spilling across the floor. The papers still came to his desk each morning, and he signed them with the same neat hand. But he no longer looked at the totals. The numbers had grown beyond meaning. Sometimes he would walk to the veranda and watch the sky fade over the Hudson. The trains still moved in the distance, black silhouettes against a red horizon. Their whistles rose and fell like sighs. He thought of his father again, how the Commodore had once stood on another shore, watching his own ships sail away, each one a fragment of his will. Now it was William's turn to stand, to watch, to let go. He understood something that his father perhaps never had, that wealth, like water, cannot be held forever. It must flow. To grip it too tightly is to lose it. To release it is to remain part of its motion. In his later years, he devoted himself to care, not to expansion, but to preservation. He funded hospitals, schools, and art. Quietly, without announcement, he turned parts of his fortune toward others, as though returning pieces of the river to the sea. He did not seek praise, he sought equilibrium. On certain evenings he would dine with his children, their voices warm, their laughter easy. They spoke of travels, of Paris and Rome, of the glittering world beyond America's railroads. William listened with faint amusement, smiling when they teased his simplicity. He did not remind them that their ease was built on generations of labor. He did not need to. The river would teach them in time. As his strength faded, his mind grew clearer, softer. He began to notice small things: the pattern of light through lace curtains, the sound of a match being struck, the scent of rain on brick. The vastness of his fortune seemed to dissolve into those details. It no longer mattered what he owned, only what he perceived. He wrote one final letter, though it was never sent. It rested in a drawer of his desk, sealed but unaddressed. In it he wrote, "The river runs through us, not beside us. We build our bridges and our banks, but in the end, the current decides. We do not possess time, we accompany it." When he passed, the house did not cry out. It simply grew still again, the way a lake settles after a single ripple. Outside, the sky was pale, and the first light of morning slipped over the city. In the years that followed, his fortune would scatter. Some would keep it, others would lose it. But what endured was not the number, it was the rhythm, the patience, the silent acceptance that all great things are temporary, and that peace comes not from holding, but from letting. In the end, William Henry Vanderbilt was remembered not as a man of extravagance, but of balance. He doubled his father's fortune, yes, but he also understood its cost. He saw what wealth could give and what it quietly took. His was a life of numbers and silence, of steady breath and unseen depth. The river outside his window never stopped flowing. It carried silt and light, echoes and endings, and in that ceaseless motion his story continued, not in noise but in stillness. The trains still run. The water still moves. The name remains. And somewhere within the quiet rhythm of history itself, William's voice lingers like a whisper. The river never sleeps. The houses of light. The third generation came softly, like morning over a pale sea, and the houses they raised seemed to hold the dawn inside their walls. Stone brightened under maritime sun, and lawns opened in long green breaths toward the Atlantic. At Newport, Cornelius Vanderbilt II set his hands, his quiet signatures, and his patient attention upon a cliff where waves spoke with an even voice. There the breakers rose, a palace of measured rhythm, facades of limestone calm, doors that welcomed salt wind, balconies that watched the horizon without a blink, and a roofline that rested upon the sky as if it had always known the weight of light. The house received the day like a cathedral built for weather. It faced the ocean without argument. It gathered the season and let the season pass. It did not insist upon grandeur, it allowed grandeur to happen. Inside, the textures were gentle and deliberate, silk that drifted like mist, velvet that carried twilight, carpet softened by years of woven patience. Light traveled across ceilings with a painter's mind, pausing at gilded moldings, then drifting down columns to the cool stone floors. The house did not hurry anyone, it invited lingering. Voices lowered without command. Footmen moved with the careful tempo of quiet music, turning door handles as if they were instruments, adjusting curtains as if they were tides. In the kitchen, copper shone the way embers remember heat. In the pantry, porcelain waited in tiers of calm, like white cliffs arranged by hand. Nothing glittered to startle the eye, everything glowed to ease it. Far from the cliff, Fifth Avenue gathered its own long breath. Number 6, 160, woke with lamplight and soft footsteps, and long mirrors held the shimmer of fabric, the way still water holds a cloud. The city's air carried coal and early blossoms. Carriages advanced with the quiet dignity of swans. On polished floors, The day arranged itself into lists, deliveries, fittings, measured greetings at the door. William K. Vanderbilt and Alva moved through this choreography with unforced grace, sleeves brushed smooth, decisions taken in low voices, calendars notched by a steady pencil. Their household, like their name, had learned the art of balance, the music of arrival, the hush of repose, the steadying weight of purpose that requires no announcement. Stone houses were not only places, they were instruments of tempo. They slowed time and taught it to walk. Staircases gathered the day into ascending calm, and galleries opened like long exhalations. Staff learned the pause between one task and the next, the gentle interval that keeps service from becoming noise. Linen was pressed with the patience of snow settling on fields. Silver was polished to a quiet brightness that did not insist. Fires were lit so that their warmth would arrive without announcement, like the kindness of a familiar hand. Doors closed with the kindness of a book placed back on its shelf. The breakers belonged to weather as much as to family. Some days the ocean arrived pale blue, almost transparent, and laid its light upon cornices in a thin, luminous veil. Some days it came heavier, a deeper slate, and the grey drew the house inward, making every interior lamp a harbour. On the terrace, morning tea steamed like breath, and napkins rested with the weight of dew. The clock on the mantel did not measure anxiety, it counted equilibrium. Everywhere the rooms carried one message in many versions: be slow, be even, be sure. Visitors felt it at once. They stood beneath arcades that framed the sea as though it were a fresco, and their sentences shortened without losing grace. Hats were removed not merely from habit, but from a small wish to lessen any wind within. Conversation became long, wide ribbons instead of tight knots. The instruments in the music room waited, patient as moored boats. When notes finally rose, they did not pierce the air. They warmed it, sewed measure to measure until the afternoon held like a fine seam. The families moved gently through this fabric. Children crossed corridors with the thoughtful steps of young dancers learning distance. Elders sat near windows where gardens flowed outward in terraces, hedges, and quiet fountains that spoke in steady syllables. The staff learned names as softly as one learns the sound of rain on different roofs. Deliveries arrived with the padded rhythm of gloved hands. Letters were stacked by height and tied with calm string. The day folded itself neatly and rested in drawers where time could find it again without effort. The ballroom of silence. March carried a soft brightness that year, and by late afternoon a pale gold slanted along the great avenue. At 665th, the lamps were already awake, and the house answered with a patient radiance. Doors opened to careful hands. Coats surrendered their chill. A murmur collected in the vestibule like the beginning of a tide and then subsided, obedient to the room. The staircase, dressed in light, received each step as if it were a petal, and the banister kept its cool, steady promise under every touch. Alva moved through the preparations with the still assurance of a conductor whose orchestra breathes with her. Nothing rushed. Needlework was checked, hems smoothed in strokes that felt like lullabies. In the kitchens, copper glowed like kept embers, and steam lifted with the discipline of incense without devotion. Platters were readied, as if the evening would taste like quiet gardens. Florists placed white and pale blush arrangements where the air would carry their gentlest perfume, never so close as to overwhelm, never so far as to be forgotten. She rehearsed the evening in her mind, the way a lantern rehearses how to hold its flame. When the guests arrived, the city seemed to move more slowly outside, as if carriages had learned courtesy from the lamps. One by one, gowns slipped into the ballroom like tides around a promontory. Jewels did not flash, they breathed, bright, then dim, like stars behind a veil of weather. Gloves met in greetings that were as brief and soft as feathers. The orchestra began in a key that felt like evening, neither bright nor sad, only smooth, so the floor could receive the first figures like a lake taking swans, without ripple, without strain, with a sense that the water had expected them. The great mirror walls lengthened everyone's calm. The ceiling carried painted skies that did not need to be believed to be felt. If a voice rose, it rose only to drift back down, becoming part of the room's hum. Laughter arrived in low arcs and ended in smiles that did not ask for answers. The dance itself seemed to move without effort. Patterns opened and closed, people turned and returned, nobody lost, nobody late. The lines of motion composing and recomposing like waves that always know where to place their hands. William K. watched quietly, his expression the color of thoughtful silver. He admired completeness where others admired shine. If he paused by the door, it was to assess the air and verify that peace still held. If he crossed the room, it was to adjust the margin of a moment so that it would lie flat. He preferred undertones, the way the violin sat beneath the flute, the way the carpet took the step, the way the supper hour approached without an announcement. His approval, when it came, was a nod that smoothed an entire hour. For some, this night was a gate opening, the soft click of entry into a circle defined not by exclusion, but by tempo. The old order felt the new order's gentleness and recognized it as strength. The hostess did not conquer the evening, she carried it like a lamp. The host did not declare, he kept. Between them, a balance, not a scale, but a pendulum that chose center again and again. In the powder rooms, whispers stayed whispers. In the smoking room, ash fell in quiet spirals and rested as if it had arrived where it belonged. On the terraces, the March air cooled every surface to an equal softness, and the city's lamps down the avenue appeared as a river of obedient light. The orchestra shifted to a slower measure that felt like the close of a letter written in an even hand. Supper unfolded as if a tablecloth were being drawn across a long field, smooth, continuous, without a single caught blade. Somewhere within that long, forgiving rhythm, the idea of the Vanderbilt name changed shape. It stopped being a sound of engines and became a sound of rooms. It ceased to be only steel and began to be silk and stone, not to replace the older music, but to harmonize with it. Rail had carried the nation's heartbeats outward. Now the houses gathered them back, taught them to slow, to listen, to endure. The quiet distance. After the ballroom, there was always the silence. The house, relieved of its gleam, stood in the early hours with the dignity of spent candles. Staff moved gently, as if not to startle the rugs. Flowers slept in their vases, the city fell into its own soft breathing, and the avenue's lights thinned until only a few remained, steady as star points holding the night's page in place. Morning arrived on the ocean more slowly than in town. At the breakers, the cliff listened, while pale light gathered on every cornice. One could stand on the terrace and feel the day approach, not as an event, but as a temperature. The house accumulated warmth by degrees, and the horizon made its long, silver promise. Bedrooms opened like shells. Breakfast took its quiet posts in sunrooms, and newspapers surrendered their rustle to the greater music of the sea. Somewhere a gardener began with shears that clicked like measured rain. Somewhere else, a maid lifted a shade, and a square of brightness stepped into a room. When days of visitors ended, when travel paused, the family learned the art of space. Corridors taught it, walk not to arrive, but to move. Libraries taught it, open a volume not to finish, but to belong. Windows taught it, look not to possess, but to accompany. The art was easiest near water, where patience floats by itself. It was possible even in town, though it asked more care. In the brown hush of late afternoon, the Fifth Avenue house would draw its curtains the way a musician draws breath. Lamps waited a moment before they glowed, and silence placed its small white stone at the center of the day. Letters spoke of invitations, and invitations spoke of expectations, yet within the family another counsel prevailed: keep the edges smooth. Children were taught posture, but also taught to sit with sunlight. Schedules were kept, but never allowed to harden. The break between tasks was honored like a small shore where one sets the foot before the next crossing. The habit seemed minor to outsiders. Within, it held the world together. Stone endures by accepting weather, and so did they. Scandals that might have become noise in other houses came and went like rain that changes the smell of the garden and leaves the paths intact. Ambition that might have tensed a room became a tightened ribbon and then relaxed. Even regret learned to take a seat and fold its hands. The lesson of the houses moved outward into speech, into travel, into the way a hand rests on a rail for balance and not for display. Time did what time always does. It layered days into years until the very idea of beginning felt like a story told by staircases. The breakers continued to face the sea with patient bravery. Fifth Avenue changed around its great homes, but within those walls the practice of calm went on. Birthdays were kept like small hearths. Anniversaries were braided into the hair of afternoons. Losses were met with doors that closed gently and opened again when the air had learned to be kind. Looking back, one might say the third generation found its crown in marble, but marble is only one way to hold light. They found it also in the unremarkable, in the way a cup returns to its saucer without a sound, in the way a gardener leaves a gate unlatched so a breeze can decide whether to visit, in the way a host remembers the pace of a guest and matches it without notice. These were the acts that made the name feel less like a crest and more like a room where anyone could put down a coat and be warm. At night, when the ocean was only texture and the city only suggestion, the houses kept their faint glow. From far away, they might be mistaken for constellations fallen to earth. Up close, they were simply places where human breath had agreed to be slow. The stones held a day's worth of sunlight and gave it back in whispers. The floors remembered footsteps and returned them as comfort. The windows, full of sky, became patient mirrors and sent the rooms back to themselves with kindness. If the dynasty had a lesson during those years of salons and staircases, it was not about triumph, it was about temperature. Keep everything warm enough to be welcoming, cool enough to endure, bright enough to see, dim enough to rest. In that balance, life could gather without clamor, part without fracture, and continue without exhaustion. The grandeur, seen from outside, was easy to name. The interior craft, felt from within, was quieter. A long conversation among stone, fabric, music, and weather. And in that conversation, the name learned how to listen to itself. The light of the stone houses did not blind, it soothed, it did not demand attention, it held it, the way a calm hand holds a smaller one while crossing a street. And when the gatherings ended, when the lamps were lowered, when the last carriage rolled away and the door settled back into its frame, the name Vanderbilt became what it had always been at its best, not a sound of conquest, but a practice of composure, a way of setting the table for time and letting time eat slowly. Deep into the night, The ocean resumed its soft authority, and the houses listened. Fifth Avenue listened too, beneath a thinner sky, where stars competed with industry and still managed to reassure. Sleep moved through rooms like a mild tide, linen cooled, floors quieted, even memory lay down. In the morning, the work would begin again, not frantic, not lax, simply measured. Stone would warm, curtains would open, tea would steam, names would be greeted, letters would be answered, music would return to its marks, and all of it would feel like breathing, unowned, unhurried, unending, until the day met the evening, and the evening met the sea. The third generation, standing in the glow of their houses of light, learned to carry radiance without spilling it. They walked their corridors as if guiding a lamp through windless weather. They set their tables as if laying cloth across a lake. And when they looked out from terraces or down long avenues, they did not chase what shimmered in the distance. They let it come and meet them, and pass and return, as all gentle things do. Later seasons gathered themselves around gentler faces. A daughter learned to step from ballroom to carriage without breaking the music that lived in her posture. A mother placed a hand upon a sleeve and changed the whole speed of a room. Invitations continued to thread the year with soft gold, very gently. In England, halls with older weather received American light without protest. In France, gardens offered models for terraces that learned to keep their edges in shade and their centers bright. Consuelo's days moved like pages turned by a careful librarian. Her name traveled farther than she did, and yet her manner remained local to the room she occupied. Lace and language surrounded her, but she kept a center like a flame a draught could not disturb. She walked galleries where portraits waited and answered with a calm that felt like agreement. Letters left her desk with ink that looked like sleep. Alva's houses continued their education of space. She understood that hospitality was a geometry, angles softened, lines curved, thresholds widened, just enough to make arrival feel like permission. She placed chairs where conversations could find their own length. She preferred fabrics that taught the hand to lower. She valued light that persuaded rather than insisted. In this, she perfected a restful ambition, not to tower, but to cradle, not to dazzle, but to endure with luminous ease. So the light remained, patient on stone, patient on faces, patient on the long water that kept meeting the shore and smoothing its own voice. The mist and the departure. The morning began in a hush of pale light. New York was not yet awake. The streets held their breath beneath a veil of fog, and the sound of carriage wheels came muted through the damp air. Inside a tall house on Fifth Avenue, the lamps still burned low, their flames small and patient against the grey. Consuelo Vanderbilt sat by a window, trimmed with lace, her hand resting lightly upon the sill. Beyond the glass, the mist pressed close, soft as unspun wool, folding the city into a single quiet shape. She was 20, and the world around her had already been measured and arranged. Her mother, Alva, moved through the house like a conductor of invisible music, graceful, deliberate, certain. Plans had been made, letters exchanged, expectations sealed. A future had been chosen, not in the language of affection, but of alliance. Across the sea waited Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, heir to Blenheim Palace, to history itself. The match was a bridge between two worlds, American fortune and English lineage. Consuelo knew the purpose, though she did not feel the pulse of it. What she felt was the slow rhythm of the day, the distant rumble of carts, the faint beating of her own heart. She touched the lace beside her and watched the mist move like breath. The house behind her murmured with footsteps, instructions, voices kept soft out of respect for the hour. She could hear her mother speaking in the corridor, firm yet calm, the tone of one accustomed to order. Downstairs, trunks were being closed, clasps fastened, ribbons tied. Servants passed through the hall with quiet efficiency, their motion smooth as a tide. The scent of polished wood mingled with that of roses from the conservatory. Somewhere a clock chimed, not loudly, but as if marking time for the sake of tradition rather than need. Alva entered the room in a whisper of silk. Her presence filled the space without disturbance, like a new color settling over old paint. She smiled, but her smile was a line of purpose. "It is a fine day to travel," she said. Consuelo nodded, though the fog outside still wrapped the city in grey. There was affection between them, but it was the careful kind, measured and folded into courtesy. Alva had built her world from intention, brick by brick, rule by rule. To her, destiny was architecture. And now she was building the future of her daughter with the same precision. The walls of Blenheim Palace already rising in her mind like an extension of her will. Consuelo rose. Her gown whispered around her ankles. The air smelled faintly of lavender and starch. When she turned toward her mother, she carried the poise she had been taught. Back straight, gaze steady, voice soft enough to suggest calm, firm enough to prove obedience. "Yes, Mama," she said. The words were light, but they held the weight of generations. By mid-morning, the carriages waited. Fifth Avenue stretched into mist like a half-remembered corridor. Neighbors watched from shaded windows, their curiosity hidden behind the pretense of morning routines. Reporters lingered discreetly by the gates, their notebooks closed but ready. The departure was both private and public, a ritual of class and spectacle performed in the key of restraint. Consuelo stepped into the carriage, the lace of her sleeve catching briefly on the door. Her mother followed, composed, her face the calm of certainty. As the horses moved, the wheels began their slow, rhythmic conversation with the cobblestones. The sound was hypnotic, a pulse, a heartbeat of departure. New York faded behind them like the end of a dream. At the harbor, the air changed. Salt replaced soot. Gulls replaced carriages. The ocean waited in a long grey sigh, its surface folding light the way silk folds touch. The ship stood vast and white, ropes taut, steam trembling in the chill. Sailors moved along the deck in measured lines, their boots making a music of purpose. Everything was ready. When Consuelo stepped aboard, a gust of wind lifted her veil and wrapped it briefly around her face. She held it down gently, her fingers trembling, not from fear, but from the strangeness of leaving a world still half-formed. The deck swayed beneath her, and she felt, for the first time, that she was no longer on ground she could claim. From the pier, Alva watched her daughter ascend the gangway. For a moment her eyes softened, not with doubt, but with recognition. She saw the cost of perfection, the quiet toll of ambition. But the moment passed, and she lifted her chin as if to balance the entire future upon her posture. The whistle sounded low and long. The ropes fell away. The ship began to move, a slow separation between mother and child, between one shore and another. Mist closed behind it, turning motion into memory. Consuelo stood by the rail, gloved hands folded, the city vanishing into pale distance. The ocean spread before her like an unwritten page. Around her, passengers spoke in murmurs, laughter like small waves against the larger silence. She closed her eyes and let the rhythm of the ship take her. The steady tilt, the low hum, the breathing of the sea. Days passed in quiet sequence. Mornings began with the hiss of steam and the clink of china. Afternoons dissolved into grey horizons. Evenings arrived with the slow unrolling of stars, patient and dim above the Atlantic. Time on the ocean had no edges. It softened thought, blurred memory. Consuelo spent hours by the rail, her face turned to the wind. The air tasted of salt and distance. She thought not of destiny, but of stillness, of how even vast things could seem small when measured by calm. The sea, endless yet contained by its own rhythm, felt closer to her than any promise of title or stone. Each night she walked the deck alone, the lamps spaced like quiet guardians. The ship moved through darkness without effort, and she moved with it, feeling her thoughts drift like gulls between wakefulness and rest. Beneath her feet, the world was both steady and alive. Somewhere below, engines breathed in deep, slow pulses, the sound of progress wrapped in peace. When England appeared at last, it was a silhouette of muted hills and pale towers under a veil of cloud. The shore seemed to wait without impatience. Fields spread wide and green, dotted with trees that bent gently under wind. Everything was softer here. The light, the sound, even the gravity. The carriage that met her smelled of rain and leather. Roads wound through villages where stone cottages leaned toward one another like quiet friends. Church bells marked the hours, their tones falling through the mist like careful steps. Consuelo watched the countryside unfold, feeling as if she were moving not through a nation, but through a painting made entirely of sighs. At last, Blenheim appeared, not as a surprise, but as a continuation of the horizon. The palace rose from the landscape with the calm certainty of something that had always been there. Its walls caught the light without claiming it, and the long avenues of trees bowed slightly toward its gates, as if in greeting. The carriage slowed. Gravel whispered beneath the wheels. Guards saluted, doors opened, voices lowered. Consuelo descended, her skirt brushing the earth of her new world. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of stone and ivy. Before her stretched the colonnades, the high windows, the measured symmetry of lineage made visible. A steward bowed. The Duke approached, tall, composed, his features carved in the tradition of portraits. His words were courteous, practiced, perfectly timed. Their meeting was less an introduction than the alignment of two designs, his drawn in heritage, hers in expectation. When she entered the palace, the air changed again. It was neither warm nor cold, but held the temperature of history. The halls were long, their marble floors carrying the faint echo of every step ever taken there. Portraits watched from the walls, ancestors in silk and armor, their gazes endless. Candles flickered in their glass cages, trembling with the weight of stillness. As she walked deeper inside, Consuelo felt the quiet press of centuries. The palace did not welcome, it absorbed. It did not ask, it remembered. And in its remembering, it asked her silently to become part of that memory. She passed through galleries where mirrors doubled the corridors, giving the illusion of endlessness. The air smelled faintly of beeswax and dust, the perfume of time itself. Servants moved with trained discretion, eyes lowered, steps exact. Somewhere a door closed, soft as breath. By the time she reached her chamber, night had fallen. The window opened to a sky without stars. The curtains hung heavy, their folds deep as sleep. She touched the edge of the bed, the cool linen smooth under her fingers. For a moment she stood still, her reflection faint in the glass. a woman already half belonging to the quiet she had entered. Outside, the wind carried through the corridors, threading its way beneath doors and around corners, speaking softly in a language older than inheritance. Consuelo listened. She understood only its gentleness. The quiet castle of light. Morning came thin and silver. Blenheim stretched beneath it like a sleeping instrument tuning itself. Servants began their motion, slow, silent, deliberate, as though the house itself breathed through them. Fires were coaxed into being, breakfast trays arranged, draperies drawn. The first warmth touched the marble halls, climbing upward through shadow. Consuelo dressed without hurry. Her maid moved around her with the skill of ritual, fastening buttons, smoothing fabric, arranging lace so that it caught the morning light. The mirror reflected not grandeur, but composure, a still surface, a calm held carefully in place. When she descended the great staircase, her steps echoed once, then disappeared into the depth of carpet below. The Duke waited at the far end of the hall, his posture that of a man accustomed to perspective. They exchanged the day's first words, polite, symmetrical, gentle as folded letters. Meals at Blenheim were ceremonies of moderation. Silver gleamed like frost. Conversation drifted as softly as steam from tea. The walls, vast and watchful, turned speech into echoes too faint for meaning. In that space, Consuelo learned the subtle language of restraint, the pauses that meant agreement, the smiles that served as punctuation. Afternoons carried her into gardens where time grew visibly, in hedges trimmed with patience, and fountains that sang the same tune forever. Peacocks crossed the lawns, their tails dragging light. The sky stayed close, its grey never harsh. Sometimes she would walk alone beside the lake, her reflection following like a companion, unwilling to lead or lag. The air there was cool, tasting faintly of lilies and iron. Letters from America arrived, wrapped in ceremony, the paper heavy, the handwriting steady. Her mother's words were full of advice, praise, design. They carried no warmth, yet no cruelty, only structure. Remember who you are. The phrase returned again and again, as if identity were an inheritance that could be carried like a jewel. Consuelo folded the letters carefully, storing them in a drawer lined with lavender. The seasons turned quietly. In spring, light gathered on the terraces like spilled cream. In summer, the air thickened with roses and rain. Autumn brought a hush of gold over every surface, and winter sealed it all beneath breathless snow. Life within the palace followed these shifts with disciplined calm, as though nature itself had joined the household staff. At times, when she stood in the chapel where the Marlboroughs slept in carved stone, Consuelo felt both visitor and guardian. The names, chiseled deep, seemed to hum beneath her fingertips. She would trace them lightly, thinking not of death, but of duration, of how stillness could outlast sound. Evenings were her favorite hours. The rooms glowed in layered amber, firelight softened corners, music drifted from distant chambers. Guests arrived in a pattern older than memory. She greeted them with the ease of one who has mastered serenity. The gowns, the jewels, the measured laughter, all moved around her like a slow current. She floated within it, untouched, luminous, detached. Yet beneath the still surface, she remained aware of something tender, a longing not for change, but for pause, a wish that time would hold still long enough for her to feel herself between the worlds that had shaped her. Occasionally, she wrote letters she never sent, to the sea she had crossed, to the fog of New York, to the house she left behind. She described the light in England, how it never stood still, how it brushed the world instead of striking it. She described the feeling of walking through history so thick it muffled every step. And she ended each letter the same way. I am learning to be quiet. Years moved as gently as curtains in wind. The marriage endured its seasons with politeness. Publicly, they were perfect, hosts of elegance, patrons of order. Privately, they occupied parallel silences, each respecting the other's need for distance. Within those silences, Consuelo found a strange peace. It was not happiness, but it was rest. She began to give herself to charity, to the restoration of small villages nearby. She learned the rhythm of English hearts, modest, steady, unwilling to rush. The people greeted her with shy warmth, and she answered with sincerity so light it felt like sunlight filtered through linen. They called her the kind Duchess, and the name fitted her like a soft garment. In those later years, she sometimes walked to the edge of the estate at dawn, where mist rose over the fields. She would stand still, hands clasped, and watch the light unfold across the grass. The birds began their day without surprise. The world renewed itself without announcement. She thought of all the lives she had crossed, the roaring ambition of her mother, the calm authority of her husband, the infinite patience of the servants who moved like prayers through the palace. All of it, she realized, was one continuous breath, neither lost nor found, simply ongoing. When news from America came, of fortunes waning, of names fading, she felt no shock. The tides she had always known continued their work. Stone crumbled. Water endured. Memory, like air, rearranged itself but did not vanish. One evening she returned from the village to find the palace already bathed in dusk. The corridors glowed faintly, the walls holding the day's leftover warmth. In her room, the window was open, and a draught carried in the scent of wet grass. She sat at her desk, opened a blank page, and began to write not of titles or lineage, but of stillness. The truest grandeur, she wrote, is to move through time without disturbing it. Later, she placed the letter in a book and left it there between pages describing clouds. When sleep came, it came gently. The house around her breathed as it always had, steady, unbroken. The wind traced the same paths through the corridors, the same sighs through the curtains. Somewhere deep within the walls, the old clocks kept their quiet duty, ticking not to measure life, but to accompany it. If ghosts lived in Blenheim, they were kind ones. They did not speak. They listened. They waited with her for morning. And when morning arrived, as it always did, she rose to its calm, dressed again, and stepped once more into the slow music of her chosen life, a life of stone and light, of names and silences, of the gentle art of belonging without claiming. The world outside went on changing, but inside the great house, Consuelo remained like a note sustained, soft, steady, and endless. The wind across the English hills carried her name without weight, and the river near the palace kept its whispering course. In every quiet thing that endures, a part of her endures too. She had crossed an ocean not to conquer, but to continue. And in continuing, she became what the age required, a bridge made of grace, a breath turned to stone, a calm that never needed to prove itself. The light on the walls thinned, then deepened again. Evening followed morning as gently as waves follow one another. And the story of Consuelo Vanderbilt, the girl who crossed from wealth to silence, from Fifth Avenue to Blenheim Palace, drifted into history like a lullaby, slow and complete. The valley, of quiet stone. South of the busy cities where roads curl like soft ribbons through the hills, the mountains rise in long blue waves, each ridge paler than the one before, each horizon breathing like a creature at rest. Morning comes there in a muted hush, the mist opening and closing around the trees as if the forest were dreaming. In that gentle geography, along slopes that carry the scent of pine and damp earth, a traveler might come upon a valley that holds its light like water cupped in the palm of a hand. The silence is not a void, it is a presence, a slow river of calm that moves without needing to be seen. Birds make brief marks across it and disappear. A deer steps from the edge of shadow, listens, and fades again into the green. Into this place George Washington Vanderbilt arrived with the measured curiosity of someone who listens before he speaks. He was quiet by nature, deliberate in step, and taken less by crowds than by the way a single hill gathers shadow at dusk. Books had taught him the pleasure of interiors. Landscapes taught him the pleasure of distances. He stood at an overlook while the morning widened and decided that here, in these soft blue folds, a house could be built that would not argue with the mountains, a house that would learn their patience and their scale, a house that would give shelter to thought. He did not chase grandness, he invited proportion. The house that would become Biltmore was imagined first as a line in the air, then a curve, then a set of slow, sensible rooms turning toward the sun. Stone would rise in warm beige courses that echo the slopes. Staircases would lift like careful thoughts. Windows would open upon miles of breath. He pictured a library whose walls carried the mild glow of age, a room where language could find its chair and sit without hurry. He pictured halls where footsteps could be heard, but quietly, as if the building were listening back. Land gathered around the idea as a shawl gathers around a shoulder. Acre met acre, forest met farm, and the valley learned a new name. The scale was large, as mountains ask it to be, yet the intention remained gentle. Fields would be rested and replanted, trees managed with patience, water guided but never compelled. Paths would turn where the land asked them to turn. Fences would follow the contour of thought. In this, George practiced a kind of hospitality. He would be a good guest in the country he owned. When the first foundations were laid, the mountains received the sound of chisels and hammers without complaint. The clink and echo mingled with birdsong, and the echo gave up its sharpness to the breadth of the sky. Workers rose in the chill mornings and warmed their hands around tin cups of coffee. The day took shape in cranes and pulleys and the patient lifting of stone. On distant ridges, clouds walked like slow animals. In the valley, walls learned to stand. The great staircase began its curve, a gentle spiral like the letter of a friendly hand. The roofline rehearsed its long, thoughtful signature against the blue. George walked the site without fanfare, coat buttoned for the breeze, a notebook in his hand. He watched the masons pause to consider the bedding of a course, admired the way a foreman lowered his voice to steady a moment that wanted to rush, nodded when a window was adjusted a fraction to meet the path of afternoon light. He let the mountains correct him. He allowed the garden designer to pause at a curve and say, with the courtesy of an equal, that a hedge should bow more deeply, that a path should widen the width of a calm breath. He recorded these things in tidy lines and returned the pencil to his pocket with the satisfaction of someone who prefers improvements to applause. Rooms arrived like seasons, the wintering hush of the indoor pool beneath its pale ceiling, the bright reach of the solarium where long leaves lifted their glossy shoulders, the dining hall whose timbered spine held the sound of evening like a steady instrument, the bedrooms measured for sleep instead of show. The library that opened like a small country of thought, with ladders that rolled like gentle rivers and a hearth large enough to gather silence and let it warm. Each room learned the rule of tone. Be kind to time. Let light arrive on its own terms. Give footsteps something soft to say. Outside, the gardens extended the logic of rest. Terraces stepped down in patient grades, stone balustrades wearing the soft glaze that only weather can teach. Beds of flowers learned their colors in phrases, never in shouts. A pergola offered shade like a friendly shoulder. Fountains did not show off, they breathed. Paths went somewhere, but they were in no hurry to arrive. The lawns rolled and unrolled with the slow certainty of wool blankets set out in sun. Woodlands stood beyond, held in stewardship rather than possession, as if the trees themselves had been given a long, merciful appointment with the future. The estate did not end at the garden wall. It went on in pasture and orchard, dairy and vineyard, sawmill and workshop. There too the rule of quiet applied. Cows moved like the hour hand. Fruit arrived in its season. Barrels cured. Timber was stacked under cover to breathe out its sap and become, in time, the kind of wood that can be trusted with weight. People learned one another's names. They learned the names of tools. The day had a discipline, but it was the discipline of care, not haste. Visitors came, and the house received them the way a lake receives sky. Carriages approached through miles of designed approach, the road bending in that generous 19th century curve that turns arrival into an art. The facade appeared and disappeared among trees, then gathered itself and revealed the whole like a story that saves its last page. On the gravel, wheels hushed as if the stones had been taught to be gentle. The front doors opened, light breathed, voices dimmed, hats were taken with courtesy and returned with the same. George greeted his guests with the pleasing awkwardness of a person who loves ideas more than applause. He showed them the library first. He always did. He stood by the gallery rail and let the climb of the shelves do the talking. He touched the spines with a light finger and smiled his small, inward smile. If a guest spoke of engines or markets, he listened. If a guest spoke of a phrase or a paragraph, he brightened. After dinner, he would lead them to the terrace so the night could do what night does to worry, set it down gently and ask it to rest. He was not a man of speeches. He did not stand upon the grand stair and toast his house. He let the stair sing its own curve. He did not read aloud from books he loved. He set them nearby and allowed curiosity to take its modest turn. He did not push the day, he helped it find its seat. This was his temperament, and it became the estate's. The weather taught the rooms their manners. In summer, the house inhaled, doors thrown open, curtains lifting like the white throats of quiet birds, stone drinking heat and giving back cool. In winter, the house exhaled, firelight curving around faces, floors warmed by rugs thick as winter coats, rain tapping the leaded glass like the gentle fingers of an old friend. Spring tied bows of green at the edges of the woods and pinned blossom corsages on the orchard. Autumn travelled over the hills like slow fire learned to whisper. All the while, the arithmetic of care went on. Wages met payroll, roofs met weather, roads met wheels. The keeping of a great house is a music of sums and solvents, of boilers and belts, of invoices and oil. George understood this without complaining to anyone about weight. He wrote his lists. He balanced ledgers the way a gardener balances light and shade. When costs rose, he drew a longer breath and answered with prudence. When storms came, he checked gutters. When guests grew numerous, he added staff with the same sense he used to add lamps to a dark corner. The mountains approved by continuing to be mountains. They shifted the day from blue to blue, offered creeks to find their way, laid fog across the hollows when evening needed a shawl. Deer came when the orchards were kind. Hawks wrote their brief letters over the pasture and signed them with a white tail. The estate learned the art of belonging to a place by not trying to own its sky. At night, after the lamps were lowered, he walked alone along a corridor where portraits watched without reproach. He paused at a window and set his hand against the cool of the leaded panes. The valley below lay folded and dark, as if the earth itself were resting its eyes. He felt the thankful fatigue that follows useful days, and then he slept in a room that kept time kindly, while the boilers breathed like large sleeping animals below. The house that breathes the hills. Time folded its gentle pages. Years arranged themselves like volumes on the library wall, each one matching the height of the next, each one adding a stripe of quiet experience to the binding. The estate moved through its days with the steadiness of an old clock whose tick cannot be heard unless the room is silent. George read, walked, wrote his brief notes, listened to the blue distances, and allowed the house to do what it had been asked to do, hold the weather of life without spilling it. The expenses of such holding were constant, neither scandal nor surprise, only the arithmetic of scale. Roofs must be kept, copper must be watched, glass must be cleaned in the direction of the lead lines. 1,000 small reliabilities must be renewed so that the large reliability remains calm. Bills arrived like the season's geese, regular, returning, perfectly themselves. He answered with courtesy. He trimmed here, reinforced there, and practiced the craft of making beauty durable. He loved the library most, and the library returned the love by granting him undisturbed hours. He would sit beneath the high ceiling while a winter sun, softened by clouds, rested in the upper panes. Pages turned like leaves on a windless day. Occasionally he stood to rescue a sentence from a laddered shelf and brought it down as gently as one might lift a bird from its perch. He read about ancient stones, about plantings, about the careful mercy of good governance. He read travel when the weather kept him home, and home when the weather made him feel the road. In either case, the house remained a companion who never interrupts. Afternoons he walked the esplanade and the terraces. He paused to thank the hidden mechanics of water for their patience in the fountains. He counted the steps of the great stair with the mild vanity of a host who likes a number to be complete. He visited the dairy, admired the quiet shine of tidy implements, the disciplined whiteness of tile, the steady assurance of hands that make nourishment from morning grass. He walked the vineyards while leaves thinner than paper learned the shapes of wind. There were seasons of illness, as all lives have, and seasons of health that felt almost transparent. There were the letters from friends who described distant galleries, and the letters from workers who simply reported that the wind had lifted shingles on the far shed. There were births to welcome with small toasts and losses to absorb the way a great house absorbs sound, turning echo into warmth. Through it all, the mountains maintained their lesson. Do nothing abruptly, let proportion keep you. The winter that changed him was not cruel so much as insistent. Snow lay evenly, the daylight arrived late and left early, as if it had other duties. In March, the doctors frowned, then softened their faces, then spoke livingly of rest. He rested, he trusted. He set his affairs in the calm order that befits a reader who has learned to place a bookmark with care. and then he left the house to its next keeper, the way one leaves a book open to a page that deserves finishing. Edith inherited the long breath of the place, and she kept the breath steady. She had walked beside the making, she understood the making's cost. The house knew her step, as it knows a familiar key. Staff trusts are made not with speeches, but with years, and she had those years. She had the gentle authority that makes obedience feel like ease. Morning found her at the window, a pencil in her hand, the ledger opened not as a burden, but as a compass. She made small circles around the figures that needed a second look, drew tidy lines where lines had wandered, and wrote the names of people rather than positions. The gardener who must have a helper before summer, the seamstress whose eyes need kinder light, the boy in the stables who has a way with tired horses. She knew that a house this size is a village under one roof. She met the mountains with the same humility that George had chosen. She asked them where to place new plantings, and when they answered with fog, she postponed her decisions until the sun returned. She praised what weather accomplished without instruction. She planned for drought by harvesting patience in spring. She permitted birds to nest in eaves where their families had always known the way. She mastered the science of the boilers and the poetry of the curtains, and the neighborly art of greeting a passerby by name. Still, the arithmetic would not become smaller. Coal must be bought, staff must be paid, the roads across the estate must be mended after every honest rain. The dairy's steady income came like a good quiet song, but the house's needs were a choir. She looked across the acres and thought kindly of every tree, then opened the forester's report and listened to advice that spoke not of taking, but of tending. Sustainable harvest, protected watersheds, trails that teach people to walk softly. In this way, the forest became both provision and promise. The idea of opening the house to the public arrived the way dawn arrives on a cloudy morning, first as a brightening, then as a shape, then as a certainty that does not shout. Private houses were usually kept private, but the world outside the gates had its own ledgers to balance, and she had a practical heart. What if the doors opened gently on certain days? What if tickets were printed in a polite font? What if docents taught the lost skill of walking slowly? The house could begin to carry a part of its own keeping. The beauty could pay its way by being shared. She spoke with counsel and kin, with craftsmen and neighbors, and found that everyone already felt they belonged a little to the house because the house belonged so thoroughly to the hills. So the plan was made without fanfare. Signs smaller than birds were placed at the drive. Hours were posted in the key of courtesy. The first visitors arrived wondering if their steps were too loud, but the stair forgave them. Children looked up into the high, still air of the great hall and discovered the friendly weight of silence. Couples found a bench on a terrace and let the afternoon fit them like a shawl. Students discovered that learning can happen when a room is simply kind to time. Artisans looked closely at a banister and realized that proportion is a form of kindness. Income began to arrive in the small, faithful way of rainfall. It did not solve every sum, it softened many. It kept the house in conversation with the century that followed. It gave the staff a new word, host, and gave the estate a new, reciprocal gift, gratitude. And if some said that grandeur was cheaper when shared, the mountains answered, as always, with weather. Clouds passed. Sun warmed stone. That was grandeur enough. There were days when the rooms were empty again between seasons, and those were Edith's favorite. She would walk the library alone and touch the rail where George once rested his hand. She would pause beside the pool, listening to the still, immaculate echo that such water keeps, an echo made of almost nothing. She would open a window in a guest room and let the hills come in until the curtains breathed like living things. In her pocket, there was always a pencil, and on her tongue, the patient word later. The story of a great house can be told with numbers, but it can also be told with breaths. The breath that rises when a visitor sees the view for the first time. The breath that evens when an overworked mind finds a chair by a fire and stops measuring itself by clocks. The breath that deepens when someone steps into a garden and remembers the vocabulary of leaves. Edith kept those breaths moving through the rooms as if she had discovered the correct merciful tempo for human beings. Seasons repeated as they do until repetition became reassurance. Spring taught the water stairs to sparkle again. Summer gathered a mild happiness around the outdoor stone. Autumn rearranged the trees in colors that seemed to speak softly from the inside of the leaves. Winter laid its clean white page over everything and challenged only the smoke to draw a line. Through each turn, the estate fulfilled its purpose, to preserve quiet in a noisy world and to extend beauty without exhausting either the eyes that look or the hands that care. When storms rose, crews moved with the rehearsal of experience, setting hands to shutters and feet to ladders, while the sky unrolled its grey rhetoric. Afterward, there were branches to clear, shingles to replace, paths to brush back into their curves. Edith thanked each person by name. She made the old house feel young by treating it as capable. She kept her own counsel, and it was a kind counsel. Years later, when travellers spoke of the Biltmore, they did not always recall the exact count of its rooms, or the length of its drive, or the acreage in precise measure. They remembered the temperature of the place. They remembered that the light in the library felt like a conversation that never turned sharp. They remembered the way the stair accepted a step. They remembered the lawns as a green breathing, the fountains as a gentle persistence, the way the mountains leaned closer the longer one stayed. In the last pages of Edith's stewardship, she sat by a window that faced a shoulder of the hills and wrote a short letter to nobody in particular, or perhaps to the future. Keep what is steady. Change what is necessary. Let the house continue to teach the art of arrival and the art of leaving. Welcome the world, but do not let it hurry. She set down the pencil and listened. The building made its small evening sounds, the civilized murmur of heating, the subtle settling of beams, the thread-like ring of a glass touched lightly in the pantry. Outside, the dark collected among the trees, and the mountains did what mountains always do. They lifted the sky a little higher, so the stars could be seen by anyone who needed them. So the estate lived on, not as a monument to a single will, but as a practice that many hands maintain, the practice of balance, the practice of proportion, the practice of giving beauty a framework sturdy enough to be shared. Some came looking for history and found it. Some came looking for grandeur and learned instead how restful scale can be. Some came only to breathe in a slower key for an afternoon and carried that cadence home. The house in the mountain mist keeps its promise. It holds the quiet that made it. It works as hard at peace as other places work at noise. It gathers whatever day arrives and returns it softened. And when the last visitor of an evening has gone, when the lamps are lowered and the corridors hold their silver, the estate resumes the one task it was built to accomplish, to let the hills breathe through it, as through an open instrument, so that anyone who listens can hear the long, calm music of a life well kept. The hills kept breathing slowly, the quiet decline. The century turned quietly, as if the world had taken a slow breath and exhaled in a new rhythm. The old houses of the Vanderbilts stood across the American landscape like anchored ships, immense, proud, and patient, built for an era that no longer remembered how to speak their language. In the mornings, sunlight still spilled across their terraces, climbing the carved stone balustrades, touching the tall windows that had once mirrored laughter and orchestras. But the laughter had thinned, the orchestras had long been dismissed. Only the wind moved freely now through corridors wide enough to hold 100 conversations that would never be spoken again. Within the cities, a different kind of music began to play. Machines hummed, cars found their way through newly paved streets. People no longer looked up at facades, they looked ahead toward motion. The gilded world that had built those mansions had slipped, almost politely, into memory. The walls that once carried portraits and chandeliers now carried silence. The silence was not cruel, it was simply patient, as if the houses themselves were learning to rest. In Newport, the sea brushed gently against the breakers. Its waves had the sound of calm persistence, touching the rocks and pulling away again and again without urgency. Inside, the great hall still smelled faintly of salt and varnish. Curtains that had once been drawn to shade the laughter of summer guests now hung heavy with the scent of years. The marble floors reflected light that had nowhere particular to fall. Rooms waited, clocks ticked, not to mark the passing of time, but to accompany it. Elsewhere, Fifth Avenue grew louder. The air carried horns instead of horses, smoke instead of perfume. The grand house at 660 Fifth, once filled with the murmur of servants and guests, stood for a time in quiet defiance. But the avenue no longer cared for quiet things. Its pace demanded height, not breadth, speed, not stillness. One by one, the great houses yielded to new towers. The Vanderbilt mansion came down under the sound of modernity, a slow dismantling of elegance by necessity. Dust rose where crystal had once caught candlelight. Yet even in ruin, the house seemed graceful, as though each stone bowed before leaving. The world outside had grown smaller and quicker. Where once a dinner table stretched for 30 guests, a city apartment now held families content with space enough for breathing and thought. Simplicity was no longer a compromise, it was an ideal. Electricity brightened rooms that once required the hands of men to light 100 lamps. Coal furnaces gave way to radiators, and the intimacy of warmth replaced the spectacle of it. The age of personal grandeur faded, replaced by the quiet ambition of efficiency. For the Vanderbilts, the transformation was not sudden but steady, a slow turning of the tide that carried away both servants and certainty. The cost of maintaining the past was heavier than nostalgia could bear. Roofs leaked, gardens grew wild, taxes swelled, and guests came less often. The family dispersed into smaller homes, into other pursuits, into new decades that had no patience for ballrooms. There was no tragedy, only the soft surrender that comes when time asks politely to move on. The grand estates became museums of memory long before they opened to the public. Their rooms still held the air of their former owners, the faint cologne of a century ago, the perfume of long-pressed flowers, the dust of sunlight resting in the same corners. Portraits stared forward, dignified but fading, their subjects slowly dissolving into the texture of paint. Mirrors reflected what light they could, as if reluctant to forget what they had once shown. And yet, amid decline, there was a strange grace. Without the weight of expectation, the houses began to breathe differently. Corridors once filled with the noise of status now welcomed quiet footsteps. Fireplaces learned the contentment of small fires. Empty chairs sat like instruments waiting for the next song. A kind of peace arrived, not the peace of triumph, but of release. In North Carolina, the Biltmore estate stood among the hills, vast and deliberate. The mountains around it remained unchanged, their blue silhouettes rising with the same patient breath they had kept for centuries. The estate had outlived the man who dreamed it, and his wife, Edith, walked its halls with the calm of understanding. She had seen the world tilt from opulence to practicality, and she knew that beauty, to endure, must adapt. The cost of such splendor was measured not only in coin but in attention, and so she opened the doors. Visitors came quietly at first, travelers curious to see what vision looked like when carved in stone. They walked through the rooms with voices lowered, as if entering a cathedral of another kind. They admired the staircase that curled like a ribbon of thought, the library lined with patience, the gardens breathing the rhythm of the seasons. They did not see decay, they saw continuity, and the estate in turn seemed to recognize them, not as intruders, but as inheritors of wonder. Elsewhere, other houses faced other fates. Some were sold and transformed into schools, galleries, or civic halls. Some were dismantled piece by piece, their marble reclaimed, their wood repurposed, their ghosts politely dismissed. A few were left to the mercy of ivy and weather, their windows blinking slowly shut under the weight of time. Each followed its own quiet path toward belonging again to the earth. Through it all, the saying lingered like a whisper, remembered at the edge of sleep. The first generation makes the money, the second holds it, the third spends it. It was never spoken bitterly, only as an observation of rhythm. Wealth, like seasons, has its cycle. Spring of ambition, summer of splendor, autumn of maintenance, and the long, calm winter of remembering. By the 1920s, the world outside the Vanderbilt gates had redefined success. Factories rose where estates once stood. Wealth no longer wore lace, it wore steel and smoke. The elegance of stillness gave way to the momentum of progress. People desired motion more than permanence. And yet, within that new hum of invention, the old houses retained something irreplaceable, the sound of stillness itself. In those grand empty spaces, echoes softened into lullabies. The steps of caretakers replaced those of butlers. Children of visitors laughed in rooms where laughter had once been rehearsed for society. The houses, stripped of their audience, began to live honestly. They no longer performed wealth. They remembered it. And memory, as it turned out, was enough. The houses remember themselves. Afternoons in those years arrived with the softness of forgiveness. Dust drifted through the air like fine ash from a distant fire, though there had been no fire at all, only time slowly cooling. The light moved differently now, less like a guest and more like a resident. It lingered in corners, stretched itself across long floors, and rested on the quiet shine of brass doorknobs polished by hands long gone. Each room seemed to hum with the low, contented sigh of survival. Caretakers became the new stewards of silence. Their footsteps marked a slower rhythm. Their conversations carried the warmth of routine rather than duty. They opened windows in spring and closed them in autumn, oiled the hinges of forgotten doors, swept marble halls whose only audience was the dust that refused to settle. They learned the pulse of the place, the way the wind curled around the tower, the way the floors creaked as though the house were clearing its throat. Some of them brought children who played hide and seek through halls once filled with gowns and music. The laughter of the present touched the walls like a soft restoration. In Newport, the breakers faced the sea with patient dignity. Waves repeated their conversation with the cliffs as they always had. Visitors arrived by the hundreds now, stepping carefully as though entering a memory too fragile to touch. They marveled at ceilings that caught light like water, at staircases that curved as if in mid-bow. Yet the house no longer tried to impress. It simply endured. The salt air wore its edges gently, polishing rather than eroding. To those who listened closely, the ocean outside still whispered the same refrain it had sung to the first stone laid. Everything returns. The smaller mansions found new identities. Some became museums of fashion, their ballrooms filled with dresses displayed in silent procession, silk now draped not for movement, but for memory. Others served as spaces for concerts, their acoustics perfect for a single cello played in evening light. The music, stripped of formality, found its echo in walls built for grandeur, but made humble by time. Even the grand fireplaces, once fed by logs carved and carried by unseen labor, now stood as sculptures of stillness. A few houses simply slept. Their owners gone, their caretakers gone, they stood beneath ivy and moonlight, windows opaque, chimneys mute. But even these ruins carried tenderness. Nature's patience became their companion. Vines climbed where servants once dusted, birds nested in chandeliers that no longer burned. Rain traced new routes through cracked tiles and settled quietly in forgotten basins. In such places, decline did not mean death, it meant return. The earth was taking back what had always been borrowed. Through these transformations, the spirit of the family scattered like seeds in wind. Some descendants sought quiet lives, preferring cottages to palaces. Others kept photographs in small silver frames, faces in sepia, shoulders turned toward horizons that no longer existed. The Vanderbilt name, once synonymous with enormity, softened into lineage, not a banner, but a thread. They appeared at gatherings, polite and unassuming, speaking of work, of gardens, of children, not of fortunes. The world no longer required them to be extraordinary, it only asked them to be real. By the 1950s, the grand age of American opulence was fully asleep. The cities had claimed the air, the suburbs stretched outward like slow ripples. Those who once sought the glow of chandeliers now found comfort in lamps and radios. The rhythm of life had shifted from symphony to hum. Yet in corners of the country, the old houses still stood like punctuation marks in a story that refused to end. Their endurance was not pride, it was memory made visible. On certain afternoons when rain blurred the windows and thunder rolled softly across the hills, one might imagine the ghosts of that earlier time drifting through the rooms, not to haunt, but to linger. Women in silk glanced toward mirrors that no longer caught their eyes. Men with pocket watches paused to listen to the rain's patient applause. Servants, unseen but not forgotten, moved with the ease of ritual. Everything felt suspended in a long exhale. And then, as if the past itself had learned rest, the ghosts faded into air. The house was left with nothing but the present, quiet, clean, waiting. In the decades that followed, the idea of the Vanderbilt homes changed shape again. They became part of a new inheritance, not of wealth, but of wonder. School children walked through their halls, teachers speaking softly about architecture, about history, about the fleeting nature of eras. Artists painted the way sunlight bends along marble staircases. Writers found metaphors in the meeting of grandeur and decay. Photographers waited for the perfect hour when the walls glowed like paper lanterns. Each visitor took something invisible with them, the understanding that beauty, once made, does not vanish. It simply shifts into memory's keeping. Even in their stillness, the houses continued to serve, They were shelters of perspective. Standing beneath their high ceilings, people could feel the scale of ambition and the smallness of time. They could hear the echo of a world that had believed permanence was possible, and they could understand, gently, why it never was. The marble did not mourn, it glowed. The chandeliers did not weep, they shimmered with the faintest approval of endurance. The world beyond their walls kept changing. Trains became planes, telegrams became screens. The new wealthy sought glass instead of stone, simplicity instead of ceremony. Yet there was something about those old Vanderbilt estates that modern luxury could not replace. The patience of craftsmanship, the confidence of stillness, the humility of time. They stood as reminders that wealth, at its best, is an attempt to hold a moment still, and that all moments, inevitably, move on. In the 1970s, when the descendants gathered once more, they came not as heirs to an empire but as keepers of memory. The reunion was held in modest surroundings, without orchestras, without fanfare. Photographs passed from hand to hand, laughter rose in gentle surprise, stories were told about great-grandparents whose portraits still hung in distant halls. And when someone asked how many millionaires remained among them, silence followed, not of shame, but of acceptance. The question no longer mattered. The wealth that endured was quieter. The continuity of names, the persistence of memory, the shared understanding that all grandeur becomes gentleness in time. The saying returned, softly spoken, more as a sigh than a sentence. The first generation makes the money, the second holds it, the third spends it. But now it sounded less like a warning and more like a lullaby. Because what came after the spending was not ruin, it was release. The wealth had changed form. It lived now in the preservation of stories, in the care of walls, in the breath of visitors who paused to listen. The houses themselves seemed to agree. Their stones, warmed by a century of sunrise, no longer strained to impress. They wore their cracks like soft smiles, their gardens, tended by new hands, bloomed in humbler colors, lavender, ivy, quiet roses. The air inside smelled of books and polish and faint gratitude. And at dusk, when the last guests departed and the last caretaker closed the final door, the estates did what they had always done best. They exhaled. The long corridors filled again with the rhythm of air, the slow creak of settling wood, the quiet murmur of plumbing and pipes, the domestic orchestra of things simply existing. In that hush, one could imagine the voice of the past speaking kindly to the present. Keep what you love. Let go of what you cannot carry. Remember, but do not return. Outside, the world went on. Trains, planes, conversations, headlines. But inside the old Vanderbilt houses, time moved at the pace of dust motes turning in sunbeams. It was not nostalgia that kept them alive, but peace. They had learned to exist beyond purpose, beyond possession, as sanctuaries of stillness in a restless century. And if one stands even now on a quiet afternoon within their walls, at the breakers by the sea, or Biltmore in the Blue Hills, and listens closely, there is a sound beneath the silence. It is not the echo of footsteps, nor the memory of laughter. It is the soft breathing of history itself, content at last to rest. The gathering of light. The decade leaned into warmth the way a hand settles on a windowsill, unhurried and sure. A small reunion gathered in a quiet house where the trees outside moved like calm water. There were no speeches, no chandeliers, no rehearsed overtures. There were only chairs drawn close, a linened table, porcelain cups holding steady heat, and a bowl of pears that reflected a pale afternoon. The room accepted everyone the way a harbour receives returning boats, without questions, without ceremony, simply with space. Cousins arrived without fuss, carrying albums wrapped in tissue and stories held in gentle voices. Coats found hooks, shoes found rugs, and conversation learned the soft acoustics of the walls. Beyond the glass, a sparrow stitched a small song into the leaves and then let the wind finish the line. The city's background murmur kept its rhythm, buses pausing, a far train breathing across rails, yet inside the air slowed until it almost matched the pace of thought. Pages turned, sepia faces kept their patient watch. A boy stood beside a ferry with the stern calm of someone listening to water. A woman held a hat with both hands as if presenting a decision. A library ladder leaned against rows of spines like a drawn breath. A staircase curled with the saved ribbon grace of a remembered gift. These images did not demand nostalgia, they invited stillness. Memory, they suggested, is not a mirror, but a light that knows where to fall. Someone placed a small brass key on the table. It had once opened a cabinet, or perhaps an afternoon. The key felt heavier than its metal, the way keepsakes collect weight from the hands that keep them. It moved from palm to palm with the care usually reserved for delicate cups. No one spoke about price. People mentioned thresholds instead. What has been opened, what has been closed, what remains faithful to a hinge, what must be allowed to drift. Numbers rose like distant hills and stayed there. Once there had been enough money to build houses that behaved like landscapes, houses that wrote tall sentences in stone. By the early 1970s, the sums had thinned like silk held to sunlight. Inheritance had divided itself until division was the main story. Shares into slivers, slivers into gestures, gestures into memory. What remained was not a loss, but a change of medium, from capital to recollection, from marble to breath. Relief followed, modest and true. It felt like unbuttoning a collar after a long parade. Laughter traveled without luggage. Admiration shed the duty to exceed what came before. A woman with silver hair recalled a summer when grass had been cut in long, pleasing rows, and the scent rose like a soft hymn. A man remembered a winter morning when the boiler woke the house, and the windows offered back a milky light. The details were small and complete, and that completeness was enough. They spoke about the first boat on the river, not in figures but in hours. Dawn laid a silver page across the surface. Oars wrote soft parentheses into the margin of current. Passengers drew their coats closer while the morning found its place in their breath. A hand rested on a tiller, a mind learned weather by standing in it. The founding story sounded modest when told this way, not conquest, simply craft. Work, then rest. Try, then learn. The river remembered the pattern, and so did they. Houses joined the conversation because houses are the furniture of time. Someone named the one by the sea, where storms practiced their patient sentences. Someone named the one in the blue hills that scaled the sky in careful stone. They mentioned staircases like invitations, libraries like small republics, kitchens that kept the day fed without complaint. Emphasis became detail, the weight of a curtain at dusk, the discipline of a hedge, the exact quiet before a door chooses to close. Cost approached, but did not take the head of the table. Roofs had leaked, paint had failed, staff had thinned as the century learned other trades. Taxes had become a season with its own weather. The room received these facts the way a field receives evening, evenly. What had been built had done good work. It had taught proportion, sheltered ordinary breath, and shown how light can be kept. Use remains a form of praise. So too does careful letting go. An elder spoke about hands. He remembered the blacksmith's palms scored with bright lines, the gardener's nail beds fluent in soil, the librarian's precise papery touch, the cook's knuckles writing steam into air. He named people and paused after each name, as if placing a plate. The room grew fuller with each mention, and then quieter, the way a garden settles after rain. To remember work, they understood, is to remember worth. Evening gathered itself along the baseboards and climbed the walls like a slow tide. Lamps were lit one by one, not to disturb the restful tone, but to sit beside it. Someone laid a shawl along the back of a chair. Someone rinsed the pear knife and left it to dry on a folded towel. Someone breathed a small, satisfied breath that meant only, "This will do. This is kind." They made no plan. They cast no vote. They wrote no oath. They allowed the simple fact of being together to accomplish what plans and votes and oaths often try, but rarely secure. The feeling that belonging is possible again. Photographs slipped back into tissue. The key returned to its small box. The bowl of pears grew lighter. The windows lost their reflection and kept the evening. The reunion, if that is the right word, proved that memory can travel by voice as easily as by road. Later, when the house loosened its grasp on the day, and the leaves outside became a single hush of wind, they rose and thanked the room that had kept them. Coats were found, hands were pressed, doors rehearsed their gentle music, and closed. The house exhaled into its beams as houses do, saving the warmth for night to hold. Their footsteps joined the long sentence of the street. Above the roofs, a slim moon measured the balance and nodded once, as if to say that the ledger of the evening was in order. The breath of time. Morning returned with a softer grammar, each hour punctuated by easy commas of quiet. The city moved on in its practical cadence, but the stories in the house drifted like light across a shelf. The reunion had left no confetti, no ribbons, only a settled kind of brightness that clung to cups and chairbacks. It lingered in the modest hush, the way steam lingers in air above cooling tea. The room seemed to know how to breathe on its own now, a slow and constant breathing that matched the trees. A few of the cousins walked later by the river. The water had no interest in ambition, it kept a pace older than plans. Barges moved as if led by patience. A gull practiced its glide. Someone pointed to a low dock and said the family's first boat might have tied up somewhere along this edge. No one argued. The idea was not proof, but comfort, a way to let beginnings remain possible. The wind checked the tide lines and rearranged nothing. Back in the room, the albums remained closed, but their presence steadied the table like extra weight at the corners of a map. The brass key slept in its box. It did not need another life to justify itself. Objects had been given permission to be only themselves: wood, paper, metal, glass. The quiet accord felt generous. It spread from the sleeves of sweaters to the corners of the room, and from the corners to the deliberate steps of those leaving and returning. The talk, when it resumed, walked lightly through old houses. They spoke of a seaside hall where winter rehearsed soft opinions against stone. They spoke of a mountain library where the hours were sorted into chapters by sunlight. Kitchens came up again, their clean sinks at noon, their restful counters at night, their reliable sense of repair and readiness. The names of rooms collected like pebbles: morning room, east room, music room, servants' hall. Each name held a use, and each use had been a kindness to time. Someone remembered visiting one of those houses after it had opened to the public. The ticket stubs were oddly comforting, like a set of small bridges. They had joined the distance between strangers and a vanished way of living. The measured route led through a hall that used to host noise and now hosted footfalls, through a gallery that once displayed certainty and now displayed learning. Volunteers spoke with devoted calm. Every word was a cotton glove, every sentence was a soft light placed on a ledge. The mood did not sharpen when costs returned to the edges of talk. If a wall needed repair, it would be repaired. If a wing needed to sleep, it would be allowed that rest. Gardens were tended by new hands. Roofs met the sky with honest seams. The estates, stripped of their performance, learned endurance. Their work had changed from dazzling to holding. They held perspective, they held air, they held a gentle scale against the rush that roared elsewhere. When afternoon pressed a warm palm against the glass, a younger cousin asked to hear again the small details. No lists were made, the rooms simply drifted through them. The smell of coal on a scarf in winter, the crisp whisper of linen when a bed was turned down, the way stairs, when polished, look like water and feel like promise, the gratitude a room gives back after it is swept, the reliable company of a clock that does not hurry as it helps the day move. Toward evening, the house invited light to stand in the doorways and remain there. It poured itself calmly along the floorboards and rested in frames. The cousins did not chase it with remarks. They let it make the rooms visible without commentary. The day lengthened the way a slow note lengthens in a patient song. No one tried to hold it in place. They watched the note fade and understood that fading is a kind of finish meant to be heard all the way to its end. Later, when the lamps were lit, a small stack of letters appeared on the table. The pages were ordinary. They contained the weather of days, the errands of decades, the proud mention of a garden rose that finally bloomed. There were no declarations hidden there, only the plain fidelity of lived hours. Reading them brought the room not to a conclusion, but to a rest. Quiet returned its full measure like water returning to a bowl. They spoke one last time about the gathering in the 1970s, the one where no millionaire remained. The memory did not ache. It glowed with the soft logic of seasons. The fortune had become a field. The field had been harvested. The stubble shone in low light. New work waited beyond the fence. Wealth had changed tense. What mattered stayed. The shared grammar of making and mending, the patient cadence of rooms, the dignity of enough. Night set its shoulder to the windows and the house leaned back gratefully. Chairs slid in with the mild scrape that always sounds like civility. The bowl on the table kept a single pair for morning. Coats rose into the dark like careful sails. Doors paused and then agreed to be closed. The last lamp withdrew its circle without haste. The ceiling settled. The floor replied with a soft reply of boards. Outside, the trees arranged their leaves into a lullaby the wind knew by heart. Branches traced a script on the sky, and the sky read it without translation. Streets kept their sentences moving, all commas and steady verbs. Somewhere, a late train stitched together two quiet towns and forgot to boast about it. Somewhere else, a kitchen tap ended its drip with a final polite decision. The world behaved kindly and the house rewarded it by sleeping well. If anyone woke briefly in the deep part of the night, it was only to register that everything was holding. The roof held the dark. The windows held their faint reflections. The shelves held their spines and dust. The stairs held the idea of morning. The table held the shape of plates it would meet again. The bowl held its last pair, bright with patience. The air held the room, and the room held the air, and both were content with the exchange. By dawn, the house was already listening. Light arrived like a letter with familiar handwriting. The first birds amended the margin of silence. Steam rose from a cup and then learned to disappear. Footsteps returned softly, nowhere hurried, everywhere sure. The albums rested. The key kept its small law. The cousins prepared to leave in the same serenity with which they had come. No doctrine had been agreed upon, and none was needed. The quiet had done the work. They embraced in doorways, then drifted down the walk under the tender grammar of the trees. The street received them and moved them onward. Somewhere behind them, a window adjusted the path of sunlight across the table. The house resumed its breathing. It would keep the gentle record, the warmth of cups, the hush of pages, the permission of chairs, the patience of pairs, the balance of arrival and departure, the simple truth that when time moves like breath, what remains is easy to carry and enough to keep. The silent current of legacy. The story of the Vanderbilts is not just about wealth, it is the quiet song of life itself, a melody that rises bright and full and then softens into stillness. From the small boats that once crossed the grey river to the mansions that climbed the hills in stone and light, their story followed the rhythm of the human heart. Work, wonder, rest. Time, like water, never hurries but never stops. It carries everything, names, dreams, voices, and returns them all to calm. The family that once shaped cities with their vision now rests beneath the gentle earth of Staten Island. A small cemetery sleeps among the trees. The air there smells of leaves and old rain. On the stones, the letters have begun to fade, their edges smoothed by weather and patience. Yet even in fading, they remain, soft marks of lives once lived with care. Nothing lasts forever, yet not everything is lost. The grand houses stand quieter now, their halls filled with the whisper of air instead of applause. Curtains move lightly in the wind where once orchestras played. The sea still touches the rocks at Newport, the river still runs past the old ferry docks, and the world continues its patient breath. In that rhythm, the story continues too, not in the language of power, but in the hush of memory. It is a gentle lesson that all things, money, marble, time, must learn to rest. That what truly endures is the spirit of labor, the grace of persistence, the kindness that builds without boasting. The family's journey from effort to elegance to quiet return is the same journey that belongs to every life. The long arc from striving to peace. At dusk, when the wind turns warm and the sky folds into gold, the past feels near enough to touch. The ferries hum like they did a century ago. The trees bend slightly, like listeners leaning closer. And beneath them, in the deep, still soil, the generations lie together, not as names on stone, but as echoes of one long breath. The story ends not in loss, but in balance. From the hands that rowed small boats, to the walls that rose toward the sun, to the stillness that remains now. Every chapter is part of a single circle. The circle of work, of beauty, of return. And as night gathers its calm, the story exhales. The world slows, the air cools, the sound of time becomes a lullaby. Everything that mattered is already safe. Close your eyes. Breathe gently. The river of history is still moving, slow and kind. Let it carry you now, softly, steadily, into sleep.